Okay, here we are again, folks. This is Dr. Jenkins, and we're following up with our lecture on muscle contraction and muscle tissue. So we ended talking about the steps of muscle contraction. Here I put them all together for you. But now we're going to move on. So we have just spent all this time microscopically inside the muscle. But now we need to take a step back. So now we're going to take a step back. Look at this picture. Instead of being microscopically in the muscle, to understand this next part, we need to step back. We need to step back because what we're going to talk about now is how the nerve and the muscle work together. And this is really important. What we're talking about is how the nerve and the muscle work together. More specifically, in order to describe this, we need to define a motor unit. Make sure you know this like the back of your hand. I can remember one of our old phys ed faculty members used to tell students, listen, when you go to cross the stage at graduation, before I shake your hand and give you the diploma, if you can't define motor unit, I'm not giving you the diploma. Because that's how important this is. So a motor unit is one nerve and all of the muscle fibers it supplies. A fancy word for supply is innervate, but we can just say supply. So the motor unit is one nerve and all the muscle fibers that it supplies. You need to be very careful with this definition because you know that come test time, I'm going to mix it up. It's not one muscle and all the nerves it supplies. No. Get that out of your head. It is one nerve, one motor neuron, and all of the muscle fibers that motor neuron supplies. Here in this picture, we've got a red motor unit, number 2, and we've got a purple motor unit, number 1. In both cases, we're referring to one nerve, but then we can look at how many muscle fibers each nerve supplies. Let's look at the purple motor unit. Motor unit number 1. Look at this purple one. It's one nerve. How many muscle fibers does it go to? 1, 2. So the purple motor unit is that one nerve and it supplies 2 muscle fibers. So collectively that's a motor unit. What about the red motor unit number 2? We still have one motor neuron, but how many muscle fibers is that nerve supplying? 1, 2, 3. So collectively, that one nerve and the 3 muscle fibers it innervates is a motor unit. We want to have a very good connection between the nerves and the muscles. I said it already back earlier in this chapter. When the nerve comes down into the muscle, the nerve has little tendrils that wrap around muscle fibers. And what we're seeing now is that nerve ending can wrap around multiple muscle fibers, which makes it very efficient. Here's a picture of what it really looks like. So here we can see that motor neuron coming down, and look at all the branches. So that one motor neuron, and then collectively all the muscle fibers it innervates is one motor unit. It's a unit. What this means, folks, is we only have to send one nerve impulse down here to activate all the muscle fibers. So it's very efficient. With one nerve impulse, I can generate contraction at all those muscle fibers at once. I went back for a minute because look, the number of muscle fibers per motor unit can vary. Sometimes you'll have a motor unit where one nerve innervates several hundred muscles. Talk about efficiency. Let me give you an example of where we would find a small motor unit versus a large motor unit. A small motor unit is more likely to be found in places where fine muscle control are needed. Think about muscles of the face, hands. So in a small motor unit, like the picture we see here, overall force production isn't the goal. It's more about having fine control and being able to move many small muscles in different ways. A large motor unit would be examples where we have one nerve going into several hundred muscle fibers. Think about large muscles such as your quads or hamstrings or biceps brachii or trapezius. Here it's efficient and I don't need as much fine movement control. I want to be able to send one nerve impulse and be able to contract a whole lot of muscle fibers easily. It's pretty cool. Now, these motor units have a lot of rules. I think I've said this before. I don't know why, for some reason when I share my PowerPoint over to my iPad to do this, these circles stay on here, even though they shouldn't be there, so please just ignore. These motor units have rules. It's really important that you know all of these. So, motor units abide by the all or none principle. Within a given motor unit, either all muscle fibers contract or none contract at all. If I go back to the purple motor unit, right? The purple motor unit has one nerve going into two fibers. When we send a nerve impulse down that nerve, either all two fibers contract or none contract at all. If we're talking about the red motor unit, when we send a nerve impulse down that red neuron, either all three muscle fibers contract or none contract at all. You can't do it half and half or any other mixture. Either all contract or none contract at all. Same thing for our large motor units, where one nerve may have little tendrils to 200 muscle fibers. Either when I send a nerve impulse down that motor neuron, down that nerve, either all 200 muscle fibers contract or none contract at all. Additionally, in order to actually stimulate those muscle fibers to contract, there's got to be a certain threshold of the nerve impulse. We're going to talk more about this when we get to the nervous system later this semester. But what we're saying is not any little tiny mini nerve impulse, not any electrical activity leads to contraction. Because we tend to have small amounts of electrical activity going on in our nerves quite often. But we're only going to trigger those muscle fibers to contract when we've purposely released a nerve impulse that reaches a certain intensity or threshold. Lastly, looking at the muscle fibers. Each motor unit, or the muscle fibers within a motor unit, contract with the same intensity. To be more specific, all muscle fibers within a motor unit contract at the same intensity. All muscle fibers within a motor unit contract at the same intensity. It has to be this way. Because of this, how do we determine the overall intensity? By the number of motor units fired. I think I gave this example in class the other day. If I lift up a balloon, I may only have to activate 2 motor units in the muscles of my back and arms. Right? To lift up a balloon, something light, I may only have to activate 2 motor units in the muscles of my back and arms. However, if I need to pick up something heavier like a cinder block, I may activate 50 motor units within a muscle. Each individual muscle fiber contracts at the same intensity. If I don't need to have as much intensity, I can fire less of them by firing fewer motor units. Versus, if I need to pick up something heavy, I need to call in more motor units. Even though they're all the same intensity, I can contract overall more motor units. Very important principles. All right. Again, we're continuing on with our bigger picture. So in this chapter, I've said again and again, and I'll say it again, I really encourage you to study this. You're going to have to, if you want to be successful, study it in small steps. How did we begin the chapter? Talking about functions of muscle. What did we do next? We talked about the structure. You need to have down the structure. Muscle itself, fascicle, muscle fiber, myofibril, myofilaments, actin and myosin, troponin and tropomyosin, transverse tubules, sarcoplasmic reticulum. You need to have those down before you can understand anything else. So once you have the functions down of muscle, once you have the structure of muscle, then you memorize and learn the steps of muscle contraction. Only after you've done all those can we go back with these other points. That's where we are now, where we're taking a step back from being in that microscopic point of view to talk about some principles. We talked about how the nerve and the muscle work together, motor unit. We talked about the rules of the motor unit. All right, good. Now, again, we're doing a general principle. We're going to discuss the general principle of how muscles contract, how a skeletal muscle contracts. Generally speaking, a skeletal muscle can contract in one of two ways. Either there's a twitch or a graded muscle response. A twitch is simply one nerve impulse. Remember, AP is another word for action potential, which is just a fancy word for nerve impulse. In a twitch, one nerve impulse goes to a muscle and causes one cycle of contraction, just one cross-bridge power stroke release, and that's it. This is what you think of as a twitch. Haven't you ever had your eyelid twitch when a bug comes near it? A twitch. However, most of our movements are dictated by a graded muscle response, where that one nerve impulse and just one little quick muscle contraction isn't enough. So in a graded muscle response, we send repeated nerve impulses, which leads to a sustained contraction, a graded, gradual, and sustained contraction. So we can contract a muscle in one of two ways. Either we just have a twitch. Usually protection is the reason why, where we have one nerve impulse to a muscle, we get one sequence of mechanical contraction, then it's over. But most of the time, we want to contract our muscles a little bit longer in order to walk, pick something up, write, whatever the case may be. That's going to be what we call a graded muscle response, where we send multiple nerve impulses in order to get a sustained and smooth contraction. Let's talk about it. We just talked about twitch. A twitch is when we have one stimulus. The stimulus here is a nerve impulse or an action potential. When we send one nerve impulse, the muscle contracts and then it relaxes. That's what it would look like in graph form. Tension is muscle contraction, really. But what if we want to have a graded muscle contraction? So in order to have a graded muscle contraction, there are 4 steps. The first of which is a twitch. So really, no matter what, we're always having a twitch first. Sometimes a twitch is enough, but in many instances, that's not enough. So a twitch is always the first thing. We send that first nerve impulse, we get a contraction, and then it relaxes. However, Now we send multiple nerve impulses back to back to back to back. When we send more nerve impulse stimuli closer together, the effects begin to summate. And what that means is, again, I send a nerve impulse, I have contraction. The muscle begins to relax, but before it has a chance to fully relax, I've sent another stimulus, which means it begins to contract again. It begins to relax, but if I send another nerve impulse, it'll contract even higher and higher and higher. So because we're sending nerve impulses so quickly, the effects of that muscle contraction begin to summate, add on to each other. Now, in reality, this is happening so quickly, you don't realize it. But it is happening. Another thing we can point out here is, look, for almost everything we do, we've got to send multiple nerve impulses, right? I'm sending many nerve impulses to that muscle so it can stay contracted. So we had a twitch, and then it relaxed. Then we started to send more nerve impulses more quickly, and the effects begin to summate. Pretty quickly, we're sending nerve impulses so quickly that we get a quivering contraction, which is called incomplete tetanus. But before you know it, the effects of the nerve impulses have summated so much that there's no longer any relaxation period between them, and we've got complete tetanus, which is a smooth contraction. In reality, we see this happening from here to here so quickly you don't even realize it. But it is happening because in order to get to that sustained contraction where myosin and actin are really bound together and staying together, we've got to send repeated nerve impulses over and over and over again. Make sure you know these steps. I believe the whole thing happens in 2 milliseconds, which is really fast. One way that I can try and help people remember this is you may, when you're working out really heavily, sometimes you might go backwards where you've done some sets and reps and you're lifting weights and you've reached complete tetanus. But what if you start to fatigue? So the nerve impulses are firing, but there's not enough calcium. Maybe there's not enough oxygen. Maybe there's not enough glucose. And for whatever reason, even though you were here in tetanus, you may start to go backwards. Have you ever been lifting weights and you're trying so hard that your muscles begin to quiver? That would be incomplete tetanus. Okay. I want to summarize these pretty quickly. These are some other considerations. We're going to keep it simple. Look, we recruit small motor units first, and then large ones after that. Your muscles are efficient. When your nerve impulse gets down to a muscle, you're going to automatically recruit the small motor units first. Then, over time, you're going to get to the big boys. This is all evidence for why a warm-up is needed before exercise. You know how we say you should warm up to improve blood flow? Whatever they call it now, pumping. It's not even a word in physiology, pumping. But here you can really impress people. We can talk about motor units recruitment, and in a minute we'll talk about the TREP effect. But knowing that we recruit small motor units first, if you purposely warm up, you're getting those small motor units recruited, and now you're getting into the territory of those larger motor units, where guess what? You can generate more force. Look at this TREP or staircase effect. The initial muscle contractions are weaker, but over time, you're going to have more calcium availability. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is going to be able to release more and more calcium. So repeated contractions are stronger. You know this. If you're trying to lift your heaviest possible weight, without a warm-up, or even with a warm-up. Is your first attempt usually your strongest one? No. So by doing a warm-up and properly building, you're going to make use of this, knowing that we recruit small and then large motor units, knowing that when I repeat muscle contractions, more calcium becomes available. All of those things can make me contract harder and stay contracted for longer. Another thing, there's something called the length-tension relationship. I know it sounds fancy, but it's really not. We can generate the most force when the muscle is moderately stretched. In other words, if you're trying to do a bicep curl or lift up the weight using your biceps, in other words, flexing your elbow, are you going to be able to lift the most weight when your elbow is fully extended? No. Can you lift the most weight when your muscle is already flexed? No. We can lift the most weight, we can generate the most force when the muscle is moderately stretched. What that means is, for that joint, it's in mid-range. Consider your elbow in a bicep curl. You can generate the most force from your biceps brachii when you're not at 0 degrees elbow flexion or even at 120. Think about 80, 90 degrees. We can generate the most strength at mid-range. Look, at full flexion in that example, the myofilaments are already overlapped as much as possible. There's nowhere more to go. At complete extension, the myofilaments are so far apart, of course it's going to be more difficult to cross-bridge them and then contract them. You need to know all of these. Okay. Now I'm filling in some of the other information. What are some of the other ingredients? If I was doing an ingredient list for muscle contraction, what do we need? We already said that we need nerve impulse. What else do we need for contraction? Calcium. What else do we need for contraction? Fuel. What's the force? What's the type of fuel we're going to need? That usable energy form called ATP that we generate from either burning carbohydrates or fat for energy. So now I'm addressing some of the other ingredients that we need to contract. Yes, we need a nerve impulse. We just talked about how that gets into the muscle. Yes, we need calcium. We know that the sarcoplasmic reticulum is going to release calcium for us. We also need ATP fuel, like putting gas in a tank. You learned these already. I know you did in sports nutrition. Make sure you review when we're producing ATP for energy. What do our muscle cells go to first? The creatine phosphate. This is anaerobic. Does not require oxygen. Produces energy for seconds. If we exercise for longer than 10 or 15 seconds, then we're going to start to generate ATP through anaerobic glycolysis. This is also anaerobic, gives us an additional 30 to 40 seconds of activity, of muscle contraction. If I'm contracting a muscle for more than a minute, then I'm going to be tapping into our aerobic respiration, which of course requires oxygen and is our preferred way to generate ATP. Know the order. Creatine phosphates first, a couple seconds, anaerobic. Then we start to get into anaerobic glycolysis, also anaerobic, generates an additional 30 seconds or so. Lastly, we get to the aerobic. We tend to always be using in combination. Shorter, higher intensity, we're staying towards the creatine phosphate. Longer, lower intensity, we're relying more on aerobic. Okay, let me just see what I have ahead here. Okay, here's what I want to do. Let's just do our last thing, which refers to muscle fibers, and then we're going to end this video. So another thing that we haven't talked about yet is when we talk about the structure, there's the big muscle broken up into smaller sections called fascicles. Each fascicle is a bundle of muscle fibers. It turns out there's two types of muscle fibers. I'm sure many of you have heard about this. The type 1 are the slow twitch. They require oxygen, and they're better for longer lasting, weaker contractions. Type 2, there is a type 2A and 2B. We're just going to be general type 2. These are our fast twitch. Fast but high intensity. Do not require oxygen. A marathon runner is going to be utilizing mostly slow twitch. A sprinter is going to be utilizing mostly fast twitch. We are always using a combination of both because all muscles have both. With training, it's possible to convert one muscle fiber to another type a little bit. But certainly, even if you don't convert one muscle fiber type to another, you can certainly train the specific muscle fiber types based on what kind of training you do. If I do sprint training, I'm really going to be training my type 2 muscle fibers. Specificity from the said principle, right? Here's an actual muscle. The muscle would be the whole darn thing. We've stained it. So the lighter ones are our fast twitch oxidative or fast twitch glycolytic, but the lighter ones are both fast twitch. These darker ones are the slow twitch. This shows us that every muscle is a combination of both slow twitch and fast twitch. To do some impressive things, we talked about the slow twitch. You know, Eliud Kipchoge, a couple years ago with that Nike project, actually ran a marathon in under 2 hours. He had pacers. This was not a world record qualifier because he had pacers. He had that light. So he would take the shortest possible route. His pacers would come in and out. Unbelievable. All right, I'm going to come back in class to discuss the rest. Study hard, folks. Any questions, let me know.